Thanks, Miriam. For almost a decade, the government has been encouraging motorists to switch to diesel. As a result, we have by far the highest proportion of diesel cars in Europe. But diesel causes air pollution, and air pollution kills over 1,000 people in this country every year. So is it time to ditch diesel? And if it is, who should carry the cost? Later in studio, we'll be hearing from the Society of the Irish Motor Industry and Friends of the Earth. But first, I've been finding out about the dangers of diesel. Air pollution is a very real problem. Our city streets are filled with diesel cars that emit dangerous particles that can't be seen by the human eye but can cause serious health problems. One of those particles is PM 2.5, a microscopic dust that once inhaled can affect the heart and lungs. It's been linked to cancer, cardiac arrest, asthma and lung disease, and it's everywhere.
We should be very worried because this is something that is invisible and is having a quantifiable health impact.
As concentrations of PM 2.5 increase, we see increased numbers of hospital admissions for heart health problems.
Ireland has the biggest diesel car sales in Europe. The problem is that the particulate matter they produce adds to pollution from other sources like industry and burning solid fuels and threatens public health. And in a cruel irony, it's those who pollute the least, namely walkers and cyclists, who are the most exposed.
The measures that need to be taken are urgent. That means increasing fuel taxes and introducing congestion and road pricing and parking charge measures that would have a higher levy on diesel vehicles.
The dire impact on health of air pollution has prompted a backlash against diesel right across Europe. So what's down the road for Irish diesel drivers?
You certainly could be looking at higher fuel prices in the coming years. Even for last year's budget, Shane Ross, the Transport Minister, implored Michael Nolan, the Finance Minister, to raise the tax on diesel.
So should we try to tax diesel cars out of existence, or will we remain a diesel nation? Diesel cars are everywhere. Why? Because they're cheaper to run and more efficient than petrol. They produce less CO2, the greenhouse gas linked to climate change. But over 1,000 premature deaths a year in Ireland are caused by air pollution, and particulate matter is a contributor. Trinity College in Dublin has been measuring the amount of PM on some of the capital's busiest roads using this device, which analyses the air. In the interest of science, I'm going to cycle from RTE in Donnybrook into Trinity in the city centre, a distance of about 6 kilometres, and my exposure to particulate matter will be measured as I go. And when I get there, I'll be able to find out just how much PM 2.5 I've been exposed to. PM is tiny, just a fraction of the width of a human hair. It varies in size from coarse PM10, which is 10 microns in diameter, to fine PM 2.5. It's these ultrafine 2.5 particles that cause the most damage, as they can penetrate the lungs and make their way into the bloodstream. When the small particles go deep into the lungs and become trapped, this can result in lung disease, emphysema or lung cancer in some cases. And if you're exercising, walking or cycling, you're breathing deeper and taking more particles into your lungs. Air quality in Ireland tends to be monitored away from major roads. To get a better picture of the effect of exposure to PM, Dr. Angus McNabola is working to capture concentrations of PM 2.5 that occur on major city roads during peak periods.
The type of pollution that comes from a diesel vehicle is quite different from when it comes from other types of engines, in that it contains pollution that have a short-term health effect. Obviously, the concentrations on roads are much higher. Now, it's not the same thing as an annual limit value. These are concentrations you would experience within an hour and a half an hour of your trip to and from work. So it's become a kind of a concern right throughout Europe, to be honest.
That concern in Europe has translated into action in some of its largest cities, where safe EU levels for air pollution have repeatedly been exceeded. In Paris, cars registered before 2000 have been completely banned. In Madrid, temporary driving restrictions have been enforced when pollution levels peak. In Athens, there are plans to ban diesel vehicles outright by 2025, and London will introduce a £10 toxicity charge for older diesel cars this year. Over the past 6 years, diesels have made up more than 70% of all new car registrations, a complete reversal of the previous pattern. So what's been driving the change to diesel that has completely altered the car market?
The Minister for the Environment, Heritage and Local Government also intends to bring forward proposals that will link motor tax to CO2 emissions for new cars from the 1st of July next. These measures will allow consumers to act in an environmentally responsible way.
Petrol sales used to outnumber diesel by a ratio of 9 to 1, and that's completely flipped around. So I guess that's good news. It tells you the Irish public are responsive to initiatives like this. But if we bemoan the fact that we've got diesel now, we should remember that we did it on purpose. This was a deliberate government policy, and motorists did what they were asked.
Of course, the government knew about particulate emissions, but they believed that tougher limits, the Euro 5 and Euro 6 standards, would reduce them and make sure there would be no adverse environmental or public health consequences. It turns out they were wrong, because while the car companies were developing vehicles that were economical to run, they were also economical with the truth around their level of emissions.
Oh, isn't it just bliss when a diesel goes like this?
We know that the Euro 6 standards on the road are not as clean as they seem to be in the laboratory tests on which the standards are based. The laboratory conditions reflected very gentle driving conditions that don't reflect the reality. That test has been reformed in the wake of the Volkswagen emissions scandal, but that still leaves us with the problem of cars on our roads now that are much dirtier than they should be.
It's ironic, really. The government at the time encouraged diesel because they thought it was better for the environment, and in turn it's had this unintended consequence of increasing air pollution.
It was well-meaning. It's doing a measure to take action on one thing, climate, without realising or considering an unintended effect on another impact, air pollution, which has significantly worsened as a result. Other cities are now introducing targets for phasing out diesel and road pricing or congestion charges, which would have a higher levy on diesel vehicles.
And is it inevitable that we'll have to go down the same route?
It's inevitable, and because public health action requires that we do that.
Those public health concerns are very stark. The World Health Organization has classified particulate matter as carcinogenic and says there are no safe levels for it. The WHO and the EU have set limits on PM. Ireland has kept well within the EU limits, but has consistently breached the lower WHO levels. With stricter EU targets for air pollution on the way, Environment Minister Denis Naughton has published a clean air strategy document suggesting ways to clean up Ireland's air pollution.
This air quality strategy is going to cover a whole range of sectors, but we know that transport is going to be central to that because transport pollution is a problem in Ireland. In a consultation document published last month, the Department of the Environment set out a few different policy options to tackle transport pollution, particularly diesel pollution. So this could include changes to vehicle registration tax, changes to fuel excise, because at the moment diesel enjoys an 11 cent per litre tax advantage over petrol, and changes to road tax, or some combination of all three.
Some people, for instance, on Taisce would say what you need to do is really change the terms of the game, bring in road pricing, change the tax structure so it's more expensive to drive a diesel, and people will respond to that.
You've got to be fair with people. If you have a family who bought a diesel car 3 or 4 years ago, because that's what the Irish government wanted them to do at the time, you can't now treat them as if they were public enemy number one and should be taxed out of existence.
One of the ways you measure it is with these monitors. I went cycling today from Donnybrook into here. It's only about 6 kilometres.
Yeah.
What are we seeing here on this one?
So we have concentrations of PM10 and PM2.5. So you started your cycle in Donnybrook, you cycled after the rush hour, and it is quite a windy day today. Your typical PM10 concentration there is around 10 micrograms per metre cubed. To put it into context, that isn't a high concentration.
But it does show that when you get into the heart of the city, I mean, this peak here must have been around the bottom of Dawson Street coming onto Nassau Street. There's a lot of buses, a lot of cars around there,
yeah.
So it does go up quite significantly.
Naturally, as you travel from the suburbs into more congested areas, you'd expect higher peaks.
So the results show I had limited exposure this time, but Angus believes there are still serious risks for cyclists and pedestrians. So if you're a cyclist, part of the reason for cycling obviously is the health benefits, but that might be open to question.
One aspect of cycling that would be negative would be your exposure to air pollution. cycling obviously has zero or very, very little emissions and nothing from particulate matter. So in a way, if you think of the polluter pays principle, the cyclist is not polluting but is paying, you know, with their health.
We should be very worried because this is something that is invisible and is having a quantifiable health impact. And the most vulnerable are children, older people, paradoxically people who are out playing sport rather than indoors, cyclists, joggers. The measures that need to be taken are urgent.
Somebody who bought a diesel car because the government was encouraging them to do so, should you be worried about costs in the future?
The running cost for a diesel car could certainly go up. There is also the possibility that in future, if congestion charges are introduced or low emission zones, something to tackle diesel pollution in urban areas, and you own an old diesel car, you could have to pay to drive into town.
We're driving along the quays here. There's pedestrians, there's cyclists, all breathing in the air and all breathing in the particulate matter as well. Is there something to be said for congestion charges or measures like that to discourage people from driving into the middle of the city?
Well, congestion charges can only work if you've got alternatives to offer people. In Dublin, we don't have public transport for people to switch to. So in that context, a congestion charge just becomes a deadweight tax on movement. You don't actually achieve anything with it. So if you're going to charge the motorists additional money, you've got to know what you would prefer them to do instead. And if you physically don't have public transport capacity, then your charge, other than costing them money, can't do anything to relieve congestion or indeed to relieve pollution.
There are plenty of options for reducing the number of diesel cars on our roads and the pollution they cause, but those options could be expensive and unpopular. The questions are, how long will it take and how much damage will be done in the meantime? I'm joined now by Alan Nolan, Director General of the Society of the Irish Motor Industry, and by Dr. Cara Augustenborg, Chairperson of Friends of the Earth Ireland. Cara, we have the law of unintended consequences here, a well-intentioned move to reduce CO2 emissions, which worked, but it has this side effect. So how do we repair the damage?
Yeah, we've had a lot of silo thinking when it comes to our actions on climate and our actions on air quality. We've learned a lot from the way we saw behavioural change when the government changed the tax structure on motor vehicles to address carbon emissions. Then we saw a change, and we can now build on that and say, okay, now we know that diesel vehicles are causing very harmful health effects. And so we need to build that into our structure too.
By doing what?
Well, there's a lot of things we could do. So we could address those tax issues, but what we really need to do is discourage the purchase of new diesel vehicles. I mean, Ireland is way above average in our purchase. We purchase about 70% of our new vehicles are diesel versus a European average, which is about 50%. So we need to get that way down, and probably the first thing we should do is actually change the VRT structure so that we are taxing those vehicles heavily so that we no longer purchase them.
OK, no longer purchase them, but the real problem is probably the older diesel cars that are on the roads already. And if somebody bought a diesel car because the government was encouraging them to do so, it is a bit unfair if the government then turns around and, for instance, increases the duty on diesel, so it makes it more expensive to drive
Sure,
one.
and so anything we do needs to happen gradually so people have time to prepare for that. But we need to encourage people generally to get out of their cars altogether. I mean, the future that we have committed to in our Low Carbon Development Act is one where our vehicles are fossil fuel free and we are heavily relying on sustainable transport options.
OK, Alan, we don't have as big a problem as some European countries do because we don't have as much congestion, because our climate does help, because there's lots of wind and rain and so on that washes the particles away. But we do have a problem, and we do have to do something about it, don't we?
Yeah, no, I think, in fact, we're all on the one side in a way here, and we've been talking earlier about the real challenge is, I think, the siloed thinking in the past is the problem that we set out to address a CO2 issue that we still have. And it has been a huge success in bringing down our CO2. The average CO2 for cars has dropped hugely, and I think our CO2 performance as a result will be better. I think the fact that we see that people behave in the way you want them to, they actually go in the direction that the policy was designed to do, we should see as a success. I think we now need to calibrate it to actually improve it going forward. And I think the problem is, again, if you say we need to stop people buying diesels, the net result is more likely that people will stay in older diesels, which are far more damaging. If you go back to the cities that were mentioned, and in fact it's often said that they're banning diesels. In fact, when you look more closely at the detail, cities like Paris and London are banning older cars. They're a bit harder on those older diesels than others, but in Paris it's all cars pre-1997 will not be allowed in. And if you look at, say, the diesel cars from pre-1997, they're about 97 the current car is about 3.5% of the particulate level of those cars. So it's no wonder the target is older cars. So we have 1 million diesels or so on the road. The real issue is to try and, if you like, make sure the older ones are the ones that we remove,
well, how do we
not,
do
the
that?
not the newer ones. I think there are different things. At the moment, we're still importing very old diesel cars from other member states of the EU, which seems a very strange thing to do when we have a problem with diesel. You look at things like we have 1,000 diesel buses in the centre of Dublin City, which you would say, look, that's an issue the state itself should actually be able to deal with. And then you look at trying to... I think what happened with this policy that we put in place was that encouraged people who in, say, Dublin City would previously have bought petrol as the most natural fuel for them, moved to diesel because everybody said this was better. And I think a more natural market that you see in other countries is diesel works better for people doing long journeys in rural areas where it isn't the same issue. There's still issues, but not the same issue.
Okay,
and
because there is relucance.
We need to migrate to that.
Yeah. But there is reluctance within government to increase the price of diesel. I mean, there's an 11-cent differential, I think, on a litre between petrol and diesel. And there is reluctance because industry, trucking, agriculture depends on diesel.
And this is a city issue, whereas diesel tends to be a rural fuel.
So is the answer road pricing, congestion charges?
I think, first of all, you will see the industry, I think, itself pushing the migration in that direction. Already this year, we've seen a move of about 3% in the first quarter of the year from diesel to petrol. So it will start to happen. I think that's a good sign. Unfortunately, there's a price for it, because for the first time since 2008, the CO2 average figure went up slightly. And there is a trade-off, and it's this thing that we should look at how we can try and deliver both on CO2 and on NOx. And we can't underplay electric cars and hybrid cars will be part of the solution, and I think that's what we've got to focus on, really.
Okay. Is there a danger of that happening again, the unintended consequence hitting again, that we get worried about air pollution and then we end up with our CO2 rising?
Yeah, and that's why we have to keep both in our minds. So we have committed through our national legislation and our UN commitments to a low-carbon future, which essentially means a fossil-free transport system. And so we have to actually get rid of diesel cars and get rid of fossil fuel petrol cars,
okay,
too.
But that's a long way off, really.
Well, that's 2050, so that's not that far away, really.
Okay.
I think the lesson, though, in all of this is that you can't jump from one direction to the other in relation to climate change policy. We need a long-term strategy that embraces, if you like, the technology the motor industry can deliver. And we're buyers of technology. We don't make them, so we don't have any investment in a particular technology. And the environmental side to make sure we actually put something in place that works.
The car industry, I'm not talking about you, obviously, you just sell the cars, but the car industry in general has done itself a lot of damage by trying to game the system, hasn't it, with diesel?
Look, our view is that for us as an industry, we need a sustainable future, so our vehicles need to be as sustainable as they can be, and anything that damages that is horrific for us. Yeah, it's certainly no favours for us.
I presume when the last change happened, your members ended up with a lot of petrol cars on their forecourts they couldn't shift?
Unintended consequences. When the change happened, and we would have been very much in favour of an environmental change in the taxation, but the timing was appalling. It was mid-year when they had high stocks of used cars, and certain cars became unsaleable. As a result, about 200 companies closed, about 10,000 people lost their jobs. Not all to do with the environmental change, in fairness, because we actually had a recession at the time, but it actually just was like a perfect storm. So we would say, look, we need to engage all stakeholders. I think we need to work to the same aim, and I think we have something to bring to the table. The environmentalists are the people who understand these things, but it is like an ecosystem. If you change one thing, you have to watch what impact it has somewhere else. And for us, it's if you do something that's either stops people changing their vehicle for a cleaner one or makes it more difficult for them, then the consequences, you will end up with older ones and smokier ones moving around the place.
But I think the real thing we could do is get families to not have to have two cars. So we could get them down to one car and they'd save 10 grand a year in operating costs.
So we need investment in public transport as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Cara.
We believe that also. Public transport is appalling in Ireland. We need to invest in it.
Thank you both for joining us. Miriam.
Thank you.